The first thing she remembered was the color of the sky. Not the alien sky, not the bruised violet canopy she'd spent 3 years staring at. Her eyes adjusting to wavelengths human retinas weren't built to process. Not the bioluminescent glow of the Moonfang hovering hanging low over the world they'd taken her to, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The first thing she remembered was the sunrise over the Ridgeback Mountains east of Caldera Basin. The way the light came in horizontal and gold and absolute. The way it hit the scrubland and turned everything briefly, impossibly, beautiful. She was sitting in the back of a government transport when it happened. The vehicle smelled like synthetic upholstery and someone's old coffee. There was a plastic window to her left, scratched and fogged, and through it she could see the highway unspooling behind them. Cracked asphalt, sun-blasted mile markers, the occasional abandoned homestead with its rusted satellite dish, aimed at the sky like a prayer nobody had bothered to cancel. Then the road curved east, and she saw it. The sunrise hit her like a physical thing, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Her name was Macy Crane. She was 22 years old. She had been gone for 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. She pressed her palm flat against the cold plastic of the window, and for the first time since they'd put her in this vehicle and told her she was going home, she cried. Caldera Basin had not waited for her. That was the thing nobody prepared you for. That life had the indecency to continue. 3 years was long enough for a coffee shop to become a hardware store, for a hardware store to become a vacant lot, for a vacant lot to grow a crop of pale desert weeds that nobody had planted and nobody seemed to want to remove. The grain elevator out on Route 9 had a new mural on it, something civic and aspirational, a family of 4 staring at a sunset. The faces were too smooth. The sunset looked like every sunset. She stared at it from the transport window and thought, whoever painted that has never actually watched one. The government liaison, a man named Ferris who wore a gray jacket and had the affect of someone who had been apologizing professionally for 20 years, walked her through what he called the reintegration process during the drive. There were forms. There were counseling referrals. There was a laminated card with a hotline number and the words "You are not alone" printed across the top in a font designed to communicate reassurance. She read the card twice, then set it on the seat beside her. "The town knows you're back," Ferris said. He said it carefully, the way you'd say something you knew was a problem but had decided wasn't your problem specifically. "We've asked the local authorities to manage any media attention." "And the other ones?" she asked. "The ones who came back before me." He looked out the window. "That's not information I'm authorized to share." She had expected that. She had expected almost everything about this conversation, in the way that you get very good at predicting human behavior when you've spent 3 years having your memories systematically dismantled by something that wasn't human at all. She still knew things. That was what they hadn't counted on. Or maybe they had counted on it and simply hadn't cared, because by the time the knowledge mattered, she'd be back on Earth and they'd be gone. But she was back on Earth, and the knowledge was still there. It lived below the amnesia like bedrock lives below soil, invisible, load-bearing, permanent. She just had to find the right drill. The town marshal was named Oleander. He had a handshake like a man trying to demonstrate something. He met her at the county line in a patrol vehicle with a freshly polished shield on the door and shook her hand twice. Once when she got out, once when he finished explaining that she should feel free to come to him if she had any concerns. His deputies stood behind him at a distance that was either respectful or cautious. She couldn't tell which. One of them, a young woman with careful eyes, kept looking at Macy's wrists. Macy kept her hands loose at her sides. "You look good," Oleander said, which was a lie. She'd seen herself in the transport vehicle's visor mirror. She looked like someone who had been somewhere difficult and returned from it fundamentally restructured. That was the only honest way to say it. "We've set you up at the Ridgeback Motel for now. Your mother's house is being, there are some complications with the estate. She let that sit for a moment. She died, Macy said. About 18 months ago. I'm very sorry. She nodded. She had known this. Not how she knew it, not from what source or process, but the knowledge was there, settled into her the way old rain settles into rock, filling every crack. Her mother had died. Her mother had spent 6 months telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had been taken by something from space, and then she had died of a heart attack in her own kitchen, and the town had quietly filed her away under the heading of grief. The motel, Macy said. Yes. I appreciate it. Oleander looked relieved. He was clearly a man who found accommodation much easier to provide than truth. Room 7 at the Ridgeback Motel faced east. She had requested this specifically. Ferris had noted it down without comment. She didn't explain it to him, the same way she didn't explain most things to most people. There was no efficient path from what she knew to what they were prepared to hear, and she had stopped trying to force that journey before she was even back on the ground. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the east-facing window and thought about the Moonfang. The Moonfang were not monsters. She wanted to be precise about this, because precision mattered when most of the thinking humans had done about intelligent alien life was contaminated by stories that needed monsters. The Moonfang were not monsters. They were, in their own frame, engineers. Patient, systematic, extraordinarily long-lived engineers who had been studying the problem of human consciousness for approximately 400 of their years, which translated to roughly 6,000 of hers. They had taken her because she was, in their assessment, statistically ideal. She was young, neurologically healthy, cognitively flexible, had the specific combination of visual and spatial processing that their instruments flagged as high yield. They had taken her the way a researcher takes a tissue sample, not with malice, not with pleasure, simply with the focused attention of something that wanted to understand. They had spent 3 years taking her apart. They had not, however, been careful about what they left behind when they put her back together. She opened the notebook she'd been carrying since the transport, a cheap wire-bound thing she'd asked Ferris to buy her at the first gas station they passed, and began to write. His name was Corvin, and he found her on her 3rd morning. She'd been eating breakfast at the Basin Diner, eggs scrambled, coffee black, a window seat facing east when the chair across from her scraped back, and a man in his mid-40s dropped into it like he'd been dropped from a height. He was lean in the way of people who forgot to eat, with the specific haunted alertness of someone who had been paying attention to the wrong things for a very long time and was absolutely correct about all of them. He put a folder on the table. It was thick, dog-eared, fastened with 2 rubber bands that had seen better decades. "You don't remember me," he said. "I don't remember much. We talked before, when you first disappeared, I mean the first 24 hours before they locked down the information. I had a blog, I was tracking the disappearances." He tapped the folder. "I've tracked all of them. 14 confirmed returns over the last 11 years, 3 deaths, 7 still missing." He paused. "You're the first one I've been able to actually talk to." She looked at the folder. "What's your name?" she asked. "Corvin, a beat. Most people call me the crazy one. I was told there was a conspiracy theorist. There are 3 technically, but the other 2 are mostly interested in the government surveillance angle, which is, yes, that's also real, but it's downstream of the actual problem." He leaned forward. The waitress came by. He waved her off without looking. "You were taken by the Moonfang. That's what I call them. The disappearances cluster on a 37-day cycle that corresponds to the hive ring's orbital period," she said. He went very still. The diner noise continued around them, coffee percolating, someone's television news, 2 booths over a pair of ranchers talking about fencing costs. Ordinary morning music. "You know what they are," Corvin said. "I know what they showed me." "Which was?" She looked at him for a moment, measuring. In her experience, The challenge with people who had spent years being right about something nobody believed was that they had developed a relationship with their own certainty that could become its own kind of blindness. He might hear what she was about to say and fit it into his existing theory like a missing piece, which was exactly the wrong move. But he was here. He had the folder. He had been paying attention for 11 years. "Not here," she said. "And not until I know whether you're going to try to use what I know or help me with what I need to do." He looked at her for a long moment, then he closed the folder. "What do you need to do?" "I need to get back into the basin," she said. "The old research station, the one under the salt flat." He didn't flinch. She noted that. "I know where it is," he said. She met Dory at the gas station laundromat on 4th, which was the kind of place that existed in small towns as a monument to the gap between the life people were living and the life they'd planned on. There were 3 folding chairs, a vending machine with one dead light, and a television bolted high on the wall playing a home renovation channel with the sound off. Dory was folding a work uniform, tan, with a name tag she'd already pulled off with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to develop opinions about it. She was perhaps 25, with the specific posture of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the circumstances to catch up. "You're Macy Crane," Dory said, not a question the whole town knew. "I am." "They say you don't remember anything." "They say a lot of things." Dory looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the uniform. "I've been trying to leave for 3 years. Every time I get close, something pulls me back. Job, family thing, car breaks down. My sister thinks I'm making excuses." She smoothed a sleeve that was already smooth. "But it's not excuses. It's more like," she paused. "Have you ever felt like a place had a hold on you? Not sentimental, like something was actually holding you." Macy set down her own laundry bag. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what that is." She told Dory about the retention fields that night, over instant coffee in the motel room, about the way the Moonfang maintained what she'd come to think of as a gravity well of attention around their study sites, a low-frequency field that made the people living in it feel inexplicably reluctant to leave, to talk, to examine the things they found themselves looking away from. Not mind control, something more passive and more insidious, the slow cultivation of incuriosity. You stopped asking questions not because something prevented you from asking, but because the questions started feeling pointless, exhausting, not worth the trouble. "The whole town," Dory said. "The whole town." "For how long?" "At least 30 years, based on the disappearance records Corvin has. Maybe longer." Dory was quiet for a long time. She looked at the cold coffee in her cup with the expression of someone recalculating a number they'd thought they already had. "My grandmother always said something was wrong with this place," she said finally. "She said it the way old people say things they know won't be believed, like they're putting it on the record anyway." Macy thought of her mother, standing in the front yard in the middle of the night, looking at the sky, certain. "She was right," Macy said. Bruce ran the only functioning taxi service in Caldera Basin, which meant he drove his 2009 Jeep to the bus station twice a day, and otherwise spent his time in a disagreement with the present that was approximately as old as the Jeep. He had the specific kind of hostility that comes from a man who had been correct about something important and ignored, for long enough that the correctness and the ignoring had fused into a single, undifferentiated bitterness. His daughter had disappeared 6 years ago. She had not come back. Corvin brought Macy to him on the 4th day, on the grounds that they needed the Jeep, and Bruce was the only person in the county who knew the back roads out to the salt flat well enough to navigate them at night without lights. Bruce looked at Macy across the hood of the Jeep and said nothing for a long time. "You were gone 3 years, he said finally. "Yes. My girl was gone 6 and never came back." Not accusatory, more like someone establishing a fact that had to be acknowledged before any other conversation could happen. "I know, I'm sorry. You knew her up there?" Macy had been thinking about this question since Corvin told her about Bruce's daughter. She had prepared an answer she thought was honest and careful and complete. But standing in front of him, looking at the way he held his hands loose at his sides, the same way she held hers, she realized, the same unconscious management of a body that had learned not to show things, she set the prepared answer aside. "I don't know," she said. "My memories of the time there are fragmented, but there were others. I wasn't the only one. And the ones who didn't come back," she stopped. "Tell me." "Some of them chose it, not because they wanted to stay, because they found something that mattered to them there, some understanding of what the Moonfang were really doing, and they decided to stay close to it, to watch, to document." She met his eyes. "That could have been her. I can't promise it, but it could." He looked at her for a long time. "You're going back," he said, "to the station. To retrieve something they left there. Something I hid before they took my memories. Something I knew I'd need when I came back. You planned this." "They taught me how they think. Slowly over 3 years because they thought they were just running experiments. But learning how something thinks, that's not a one-way process." She paused. "They didn't count on that." Bruce looked at the jeep. He looked at the sky, the late afternoon sky, beginning its turn toward that golden hour she had been chasing since the transport window. "I need to know one thing," he said. "What?" "If we do this, if we go out there and you get what you're after, what happens to them? To the Moonfang?" She considered how to answer that. She thought about precision, about the way sloppy thinking about alien life always collapsed into the same two shapes, monster or savior, destroyer or redeemer. She had lived among the Moonfang for 3 years. She had been their subject, their instrument, their data. She had also, in the careful, wordless way of a consciousness that needed to understand anything it was processing, come to understand them in ways that made simple answers impossible. "They don't stop," she said finally. "That's the honest answer. They won't stop studying. They won't stop taking. It's not malice, it's just what they are. But they can be made to understand that the terms have changed, that the people they've been studying are no longer only subjects." She looked at him steadily. "They can be made to see us as a variable they hadn't accounted for, and that changes the equation." "How?" "Because they're engineers," she said. "And the one thing engineers respect, in any language, in any biology across any distance, is a problem they didn't see coming." The Salt Flat was 3 hours east by back road, navigable only because Bruce had driven it so many times over 6 years that the route was encoded in his hands rather than his memory. He drove without lights after the last county road petered out, moving by starlight and something that looked like instinct, but was probably just grief given direction. Corvin sat in the back with his folder open on his knees, reading by a headlamp he kept angled low. Macy rode in front, watching the darkness. Dory had wanted to come. Macy had asked her to stay, to be the one who stayed, the person who knew where they'd gone and could answer questions if things didn't go the way they needed to go. Dory had argued, and then she had understood, and the understanding had settled on her face with the particular weight of someone who had always suspected that the real work happened in the holding on rather than the going out. "Tell me about the station," Corvin said. "It was built in the 1960s, Macy said. Ostensibly a seismic monitoring facility. By the time it was decommissioned in the 1990s, it had been used for about 15 years as a contact point. The Moonfang identified it as a neutral site. They're careful about those. Places where they can leave something without it constituting an incursion. The government researchers who worked there in the 80s didn't understand what they were looking at, but they documented everything, which meant when the Moonfang came back to use the station as a secondary cache, the documentation was still there." "Cache of what?" Corvin said. "Memory architecture," she said. The way they store and transfer knowledge is different from us. They use a kind of crystallized information structure, not digital, not biological exactly, something between the two. They've been caching data at the station for about 40 years. A pause. Including mine. The Jeep hit a rut and Bruce steered through it without slowing, both hands easy on the wheel. They cached your memories, Corvin said. They always do, with subjects they intend to return. It's preservation. They archive everything they extract before they start the real work. If you don't archive, you risk corrupting the baseline. She looked out the window at the stars, familiar constellations, the first time she'd seen familiar ones in 3 years, and she still felt the pull of the alien sky, the way anything you've stared at long enough becomes the standard. They left my archive at the station because they planned to finish with me and return everything before they released me. Standard procedure. They didn't, Bruce said. Something changed their timeline. I don't know what. They released me faster than they planned, and they didn't have time to complete the restoration. I went back with the amnesia partly intact and the archive still in the station. A beat. But I knew about the station. I'd seen their records. I knew what they keep there and where and how to access it. Because they taught you how they think, Corvin said. Yes. And that's what they didn't count on. Among other things. They drove in silence for a while. The salt flat appeared ahead of them as a pale expansion in the darkness, catching starlight and giving it back slightly altered, the way memory gives back experience, recognizable but not identical. There are two, Macy said. I need to tell you this before we get there, not just my archive. There's a second structure larger, the accumulated observations from 40 years of active study, every disappearance, every subject, complete physiological and psychological records. She paused. Including your daughter, Bruce. The Jeep didn't slow. Bruce's hands didn't move on the wheel. Where, he said. Same location, adjacent structure. And you're going to tell me we can't touch it. I'm going to tell you that what we do with it determines what comes after. She turned to look at him directly. We could destroy it. I know how to do that. I know the resonance frequency that collapses their crystalline storage. Everything in there becomes noise, all of it gone, every record they've kept. She let that sit. Or we could take it. He drove. Take it, he said. It's not simple, it's... I know it's not simple. His voice was level. The voice of a man who had been living inside a complicated thing for 6 years and had long since run out of patience for being warned about its complexity. I know it means they'll know we have it. I know it changes whatever deal you think you're setting up with them. I know it might make things worse in ways we can't predict. He looked at the pale flat ahead. Take it anyway. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. The station entrance was a steel hatch set flush with the salt flat, secured with a lock that would have seemed substantial to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning Moonfang security architecture. Macy crouched over it with Corvin's flashlight and a piece of equipment she'd built over the previous 3 days from components available at the hardware store, which had replaced the coffee shop, she remembered, and which had coincidentally stocked precisely what she needed. A coincidence she had decided not to examine too closely. The lock released, she had always known it would. The hatch swung down. Cold air came up dry, metallic, with an undertone that was not quite ozone and not quite anything terrestrial. The smell of a place that had been carefully maintained by something that didn't breathe. She went first, Corvin behind her, Bruce last, pulling the hatch closed above them. The stairs were concrete, solid, recently cleaned despite the decade of apparent disuse above. The Moonfang were meticulous about their infrastructure. The lights, installed by human hands in the 1980s, maintained by something else since, came on automatically as they descended, triggered by motion or heat, or perhaps simply the recognition of something they'd been designed to recognize. The main chamber was 40 feet below the salt. It was larger than she'd expected, Even knowing the dimensions scale was difficult to hold in the abstract. The walls were lined with racks of equipment that was partly human in origin and partly not. Junction boxes and cable management systems, sitting alongside structures that looked organic but weren't, pale and branching and faintly luminescent in the artificial light. In the center of the room, two structures. The first was small, approximately the size and shape of a hatbox, translucent, the light inside moving in slow, rhythmic pulses. The second was the size of a filing cabinet. Its light was slower, deeper, almost geological in its patience. "Mine is the small one," Macy said. "Yours is the other." Bruce walked to the large structure and stood in front of it. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, looking at the moving light inside. "She's in there," he said. What she knew, what she felt, what she experienced, all of it exactly as it was. "Is she still?" "I don't know, honest. I don't know if she came back on a different transport on a different timeline. I don't know if she's still up there. I know her record is here. She came to stand beside him. Whatever happened to her, this is hers, not theirs." He reached out and put his hand flat against the surface of the structure. The light inside shifted slightly, acknowledging contact, perhaps, or simply responding to heat. "How do we take it?" "I'll show you." She had the carrying case in her pack, a modified insulated container, the kind used for biological samples, lined with specific materials she'd sourced from 3 different hardware and hobby stores over 3 days, assembling the shielding from first principles, and the knowledge in her bones that she hadn't been able to name until the sunrise found it. It took 40 minutes to safely transfer the large archive, 20 for her own. Corvin spent the time documenting the chamber with his phone camera, methodical, narrating quietly under his breath, the way a person does when they need to process what they're seeing and haven't yet found the words, but know they'll need them later. When they were done, she stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the empty racks where the structures had been. "They'll know," she said. "They'll know immediately. The structures transmit status to the hive ring." "So they know we're here," Corvin said. "They know someone has the archives. They won't know it's me specifically, not yet. But they'll know it's human, and they'll know it was intentional." "What does that mean for us?" She thought about the Moonfang, about the specific quality of their attention when they encountered something unexpected, not alarm, not fear, nothing as reactive as that. More like the recalibration of a very large instrument, the slow rotation of something immense toward a new signal. "It means we have approximately 12 hours before the next orbital approach," she said. "After that, they'll have line of sight to the retrieval location and full diagnostic capability." She picked up the case with her archive. "We need to be somewhere visible." "Visible," Corvin said. "Not hiding, not running, visible." She looked at him, then at Bruce. "That's the part they haven't calculated. Every subject who came back, every person who encountered their infrastructure, everyone ran or went silent. The whole history of human Moonfang contact from their side has been the study of things they could contain. And we're not doing that," Bruce said. "We're not doing that." She moved toward the stairs. "We're going to stand in the middle of the salt flat at sunrise," she said, "with the archives, in the open, and we're going to wait for them to pay attention." They drove back in silence mostly. Corvin fell asleep in the back seat somewhere around midnight, his folder finally closed, his head against the window with the relaxed surrender of a man who had been wound tight for a decade and had finally, provisionally, set something down. Macy watched the road and the stars and thought about language. The Moonfang didn't communicate the way humans did. Not in the sense of speech or signal or even the structured exchanges she'd seen in every science fiction story she'd consumed before the age of 19. Their communication was structural, embedded in architecture, in the arrangement of materials, in what you built and where and how, and in what orientation relative to what else. You didn't speak to them. You constructed something, and the construction was the message. She had spent the whole of her time with them learning to read that language. She hadn't realized she was doing it. She hadn't realized they were teaching her, in the way that the most important lessons are often the ones that don't announce themselves. But she knew now what she was going to build on the salt flat at sunrise. She'd been building it in her mind for the entire 3 days since her return, assembling the pieces without letting herself look at it directly, the way you sometimes have to approach a difficult thing, sideways, in your peripheral vision, until it's complete enough to bear looking at straight. The structures from the chamber had been created using materials the Moonfang sourced from Earth. That was always the way with their caches, local materials, processed through their technology, reconfigured. The materials in the archives were the same materials as everything else in Caldera Basin, just differently arranged. What she was going to do was rearrange them. In the language they had, without knowing they were doing it, spent 3 years teaching her to speak. She slept for 3 hours in the motel room with the east-facing window. She dreamed about her mother's kitchen, the exact quality of light on Tuesday mornings, the sound of the kettle, a specific creak in the 3rd floorboard from the door. Not a sad dream, a precise one. The kind that felt less like a dream and more like a document, the mind filing something it needed to keep. She woke in the dark, dressed, took the case and the notebook and walked to the gas station where Bruce had said to meet. He was already there. He had 2 coffees from the machine and handed her one without ceremony. The sky in the east was still black. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "No." She nodded. She hadn't expected him to. Dory arrived 10 minutes later in her own car, driving with the specific purposeful calm of someone who had made up their mind and had finished second-guessing it. Corvin came on foot from a direction that suggested he had been awake and walking since they'd dropped him off. "What do we need?" Dory said. "Time," Macy said. "About 2 hours, and all of you on the flat visible." "That's it. That's the part that matters." She looked around the circle of them, the man who had been right about everything and been ignored, the man who had been hollowed by loss and filled the hollow with precision, the woman who had been trying to leave a place that wouldn't let her go. You're all in their records, study subjects, secondary data, background variables in their model of this town. She let that sit for a moment. They have never, in 40 years of active study, had their data do anything back. The drive to the flat was quiet and fast. The sky began to change at the eastern horizon, not light yet, just the announcement of light, that shift in quality that comes before color. She worked quickly in the dark, using the headlamps from 2 vehicles arranged to give her precise illumination without casting her own shadow across the work. The materials from the archives, she had known she would have to open them partially, access the structural components without corrupting the stored information, a surgical separation that required everything she understood about how the Moonfang thought and built and ordered their world. She built. It was not large, perhaps 6 feet across, but scale wasn't the point. The Moonfang didn't evaluate communication by volume, by spectacle, by force. They evaluated it by precision, by the correctness of arrangement, by the evidence that the sender understood what they were sending, which required understanding the language, which required understanding the mind of the recipient, which was the single thing no human had ever done before, and the single thing she had spent 3 years learning to do without knowing that was what she was learning. Corvin stood to her left, his phone recording. Bruce stood to her right, hands easy at his sides. Dory stood behind them, watching the eastern sky. The structure she built was a question, written in the only language she knew the Moonfang would recognize, the language of correct arrangement, of precise relationship between component parts, of architecture that demonstrated understanding of the architect. It said, "We know how you think. We have what you built here. We are not hiding. We are not running. We are standing in the light. What do you want to do about that?" It also said something else. something she hadn't articulated to the others because there wasn't a clean way to translate it, but that she knew was true. We have always been more than your data. We always were. You just weren't measuring the right things. She stepped back from the structure, looked at it. Is it right? Corvin said quietly. Yes, she said. She was certain the way she'd been certain about the sunrise, not thought through, not calculated, just known from below the level of thought, from whatever part of a person holds the things that have been worked into them over years of patient attention. Now, Bruce said. Now we wait for the light. The sunrise came the way sunrises over the salt flat always came, slowly until it didn't, and then all at once, the way the most important things happen. It came in gold and horizontal and absolute, hitting the salt flat and throwing long shadows west. And then it hit the structure she had built, and the structure caught the light and held it differently than the flat white salt around it, in a way that would be visible from the sky, from altitude, from the specific geometry of an orbital approach. A visible message in a language they could read. She stood in it, they all stood in it. The orbital window was approximately 6:47 a.m., Corvin had calculated, based on 11 years of tracking the hive ring's approach patterns. That was 13 minutes from now. She stood in the sunrise and felt the light on her face and thought about 3 years under a violet sky and what it had cost her and what it had given her, and how those two things were not as separate as she had believed when she was a 19-year-old girl on her way home from a night shift who had looked up at something in the sky and made the mistake of stopping to watch it. She had stopped to watch it. She would always be the kind of person who stopped to watch. That was the thing they had not calculated, not the specific knowledge she'd extracted from their methods, not the archive retrieval, not the message on the salt flat. The thing they had not calculated was simpler and more fundamental, that a consciousness which watches, which pays attention, which refuses to stop looking at things just because looking at them is dangerous, will eventually see something it can use. They had been studying her. She had been studying them. The difference was that she had known she was doing it and they had not. At 6:47 a.m., the hive ring reached its orbital approach over Caldera Basin. They felt it before they saw it, a pressure in the air, a change in the quality of light that had nothing to do with the sun, a low harmonic at the edge of hearing that was more sensation than sound. Corvin's recording equipment noted a sudden spike in the electromagnetic readings he'd been capturing. Bruce looked up. The hive ring was not visible in daylight to the naked eye under normal conditions. The Moonfang had designed it that way. They were careful, methodical, patient. But the approach was close, and the angle was precise, and for approximately 90 seconds the angle of sunlight and the angle of the orbital path created a reflection that was visible even in the morning sky, a pale ring, like a second moon, hanging at the edge of the east where the sky was still that particular shade of deep blue that morning holds before it fully gives way to day. Macy looked at it, it looked back. She thought about what she'd been told in the transport 3 days ago. You are not alone. She thought about the hotline card with its reassuring font. She thought about Ferris in his gray jacket and Oleander with his careful handshake, and the 30 years of a town that had been slowly, quietly, patiently made incurious by something it couldn't see. She thought about her mother in the front yard in the middle of the night looking at the sky, certain, right, unbelieved. She thought about Bruce's hands on the wheel of the Jeep, easy, steady, driving a grief-carved road for 6 years because it was the only road that led anywhere true. She thought about Corvin's folder, rubber-banded and dog-eared and filled with 11 years of being correct in the dark. She thought about Dory, who had felt the hold and named it as a hold, and refused to stop looking at it even when looking at it felt pointless. She raised her hand. Not in surrender, not in greeting exactly, in the specific gesture that the structure on the salt flat had already made in her language. I am here. I see you. I know what I am to you. I am telling you that the terms have changed. The ring held its position for the full 90 seconds of the approach window. Then it shifted, not away, but laterally, a movement that to Corvin's instruments registered as a frequency chain, and that to Macy registered as something she didn't have a human word for, a structural acknowledgement, a recalibration. Then it was gone. No fire, no dramatic intervention, no ultimatum, no declaration of war or peace or whatever binary humans typically imagined was the only available outcome of contact. Just an acknowledgement. Just the massive slow rotation of an immense instrument toward a new signal. Just the beginning. In the days that followed, she did not go back to the motel. Bruce had a spare room, which he offered with a matter-of-factness that she'd learned to recognize as the way people who had survived genuinely hard things expressed care. Not through elaboration, but through the quiet provision of space and coffee, and the willingness to sit in the same room without requiring the silence to be filled. Corvin uploaded his documentation to everywhere he could think of, in every format he could generate. The response was what it usually was at first: derision, then curiosity, then a specific kind of anxious attention from people in institutions that had other names for what he was describing. He had been waiting 11 years for this. He processed it with a steadiness that surprised her, until she understood that the steadiness was just what certainty looks like when it finally gets confirmed. Dory left, 3 days after the sunrise. She drove out of Caldera Basin on a Tuesday morning with 2 bags and her work uniform washed, folded, placed on the break room table with a note. She called Macy from the highway to say she'd made it past the county line. Her voice on the call had a quality Macy associated with altitude, lighter, freer, the sound of a pressure that had been so constant it had become imperceptible finally lifting. The Moonfang did not take anyone from Caldera Basin again. Not in the weeks that followed, not in the months. Whether this was in response to what she'd built on the Salt Flat, or whether it was a recalculation of their study protocols, or whether it was something she hadn't named and couldn't yet see, she didn't know. She wasn't certain. She was comfortable with that. What she knew was that the archival structures were safe and intact, and that her memories lived in them, and that every night she could sit with them and let the fragmented years slowly, carefully reassemble themselves, not into what she had been before, but into something shaped by all of it, the taking and the returning, the violet sky and the gold one, the things she'd learned about the way a mind that isn't human thinks, and what that revealed by contrast about the mind that was. She sat in the east-facing room. She wrote in the notebook. She thought about her mother who had been right. She thought about what it meant to be a data point that had been watching the whole time. She thought we have always been more than what they measured. She thought the sunrise changed everything. Outside, the light came in horizontal and gold and absolute, and she let it, and she kept her eyes open, and she did not look away.